So welcome, David Smith, to OMSC's Roundtable, a new media series done by OMSC. I am so privileged to have you on here at the Roundtable to interview you, to get to know more about you. So thank you so much, David.
Delighted to be here, yeah.
For many of those who might be watching our Roundtable, could you briefly introduce something about you, where did you do your academic training, your master's level, and what institution you are currently at?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I can sort of start backwards and say I'm currently at the University of Bonn in Germany, working with the Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies, again doing my PhD there in one of these sort of strange structured excellence clusters that the German federal and state governments have designed, but nonetheless find it quite rewarding. I did my bachelor's study at a little school called Montreat College in North Carolina, which, if you're a Southern Presbyterian from the U.S., maybe you know of it because Montreat Conference Center is right there. But I studied religion and philosophy for my undergrad, and then I went on to PTS right near, well, on the same campus as the OMSC. So I know the stomping grounds that you're still in. Did my MDiv there, and then I went on to be a pastor of a church. I was an associate pastor at Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church, which is not that far from Princeton either, right outside Philadelphia. Then I went over to Germany, did a Master of Ecumenical Studies with the Protestant Theology faculty in Bonn. And then I sort of made my way around, short-term study to a few other places, did a residency at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital, where I had also done my CPE, and then eventually found my way into the PhD program at BCDSS, but in church history with the theology faculty.
That's amazing, this dual calling, dual vocation, right? Both one foot in academia and the other within, pastoral, how do you say, a pastoral job, or within, worship within the church. Very fascinating, I think, that you are taking both of this at heart and carrying them out as well. One of the things that I'm curious about is your program in Germany, in your university. Could you explain a little bit more for those that might be watching from a North American context? Something, maybe some of our listeners and even those that are watching might be interested in the program that you are in as well.
Absolutely, yes. So I think there are sort of two pieces of this program that are actually separate within the university, but both sort of pathways for people who would be interested in coming to Bonn. The first, which is perhaps most relevant for world Christianity studies, people who are passionate about the discourse in which we're involved here, is the Master of Ecumenical Studies program at the University of Bonn, from which I'm a graduate, and I also serve still as an alumni ambassador. So, for people who are interested, we can get in touch for sure. It's a little bit of advertising there. The American salesman still comes out sometimes.
Oh, please! Yeah, I want to provide a platform for you.
There we go. Yes. Well, it's a fantastic program. You can do it in 1 year or two, depending on the qualifications that you bring to the table. And also the Protestant Theology faculty has just also announced or released a new program, two of them actually. One in Master in Biblical Studies, which is a 1 year. So if you've already got your Greek and your Hebrew, you can step into that program. Very much like a THM in an American context, but it is an MA. And then also we've announced an international PhD program that you can do in any of the disciplines in Germany. And it's a little bit different than the program I'm in, which is the old school Dr. Teal, it's good enough for Luther, it's good enough for me. Even though I'm Presbyterian, but this is yes. So that's the sort of traditional theology track, and then also several years ago, the German federal and states governments launched what they call the Excellence Initiative, where they have essentially tried to create huge pots of money to found innovative new research. This is across all disciplines. So one of our neighbors at the BCDSS is I can't even pronounce the full name, but they're essentially making robots to do agricultural work.
Wow.
And this is also an excellence cluster. We have another neighbor, Econ Tribune, which is doing economics and public policy. So it's a quite broad spectrum. And of course, one of these, the most clusters in Germany are actually at the University of Bonn. So we're proud to call ourselves a University of Excellence, whatever that means. I think we're still exploring that. We often have a joke of, okay, if this is excellence, I don't know. But all in love, of course. And so the BCDSS is part of this. We received a substantial amount of funding several years ago, and this is done at 6-year intervals. So the BCDSS has essentially created this Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies from the ground up. So some of the folks who are much more involved in the administration than I, the people with actual responsibilities in that way, have told me about, essentially creating master's programs within months. So this has been a real sort of, it's taken a lot of investment, but there are 2 master's programs. One is a 1-year program in slavery studies, and this, at BCDSS, we try to take a global and trans-period approach, if we want to use that term. Problematizing periodization, for example, not uncommon in world Christianity conversations. So we would study everything from ancient forms of slavery to contemporary forms in those settings. So that's a 1-year program. And then the second is Master of Dependency, Slavery and Dependency Studies, which you can see our center is actually the Center for Slavery and Dependency Studies. A lot of people in world Christianity conversations come to the BCDSS thinking, okay, so this is Latin American dependency theory, right. 1970s, 1980s, sort of Marxist-oriented approach. And while we've certainly had conversations along those lines, and there are certainly people taking that avenue, it's the concept as it's used in Bonn very much came out of slavery studies. So, and it was essentially a recognition of the fact that some form of slavery, some form of what we would call strong asymmetrical dependency is ubiquitous across human societies. That we have evidence of this in varied forms. And we observed, of course, that there is a real limitation in the language around, for example, we could even talk in terms of modern slavery. I'll just take an example. There are those who say, well, we shouldn't use that term because slavery is very much tied to the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, right, and all that. And we could get into those debates, but without doing that here, we think that the term asymmetrical dependency as an analytical concept, not necessarily, I don't foresee seeing it on posters at a protest anytime soon, but as an analytical concept, as an academic tool, a heuristic, can help us to tease out the intricacies that are involved in these different forms of strongly asymmetrical relationships. Not to deny, of course, the enduring legacy of past forms of slavery and dependency, or to challenge the sort of existential experiences of those phenomena that continue today, but to help give us a more complex view as academics in this process. So the master's students, they're introduced to that process in either the 1-year or the 2-year program, and then we also have 45 PhD researchers. I'm one of those, nearing the end of my time as a PhD, I hope. We also have a great deal of postdoc researchers, some of whom are doing their own projects, some of whom are research group leaders, which in a German context, you don't have assistant and associate professors. You're either a wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter, a research with worker, we would say, or you are a full professor. And there are, of course, now junior professorships that are emerging, but these research group leaders, my supervisor, wonderful supervisor, Julia Winnebeck, for example, has this position, and so they would be the equivalent of an assistant or an associate professor elsewhere that are guiding the research of concentrated programs. Our research group focuses on late antique and early medieval church history and the dependency relations that we can see there.
Wow, thank you for that comprehensive introduction. I think this is really helpful for those that are new to German academic institutions, especially yours that you are currently at. And I think many will find this helpful in kind of understanding, they might have a wrong impression just by the name itself, but with your explanation, very helpful. Thank you, David, for that. Before we go into talking now, what you specifically work in terms of your dissertation project, I do also want to provide some space for you, some time to talk about some of your ongoing other projects. Again, aside from your dissertation project, which we will talk about, what are some of the side projects that you've been working on? What are you passionate about? Do you mind talking a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I'm sure my supervisor would love for there to be less of those that were ongoing, but nonetheless, here we are. So I'm still at the stage of my academic journey of really sort of articulating. I think I have a sense of, okay, I want to go in the direction of world Christianity, but what avenue within that? As we all know, and as we've seen in this conference here, there are many avenues that you could travel within even our relatively burgeoning discourse. And so as I started the PhD, I was finishing up some projects specifically on the polity and church law discussions that went into the evolution of the debate around LGBTQ membership, ordination, and marriage in the Presbyterian Church USA. And this was very much an existentially driven project, but also one of genuine academic interest. In the Presbyterian world, of course, at least in the USA, polity has often been used to address theological challenges in a way that ideally, though not always in practice, upholds unity and so on. Amid diversity, we could say, unity amid diversity. But so I was really interested in not only how the church law, we could say, the polity, developed around these questions from the late 1960s / early 70s onward, but also what precedents were drawn upon. And so I ended up developing a rather extensive project that ended up in one large publication and one that's soon to come out, a shorter publication, that essentially tries to trace some of the polity principles, not in a sort of teleological way, but in the sense of how could these arguments be made from a polity perspective on both sides of this discourse, or on all sides, we could say. And that's what those projects were. That took me through the first few years. While learning my Latin, we have to do the Grossa Latinum there, which my high school Latin didn't do the job. And so then I have also done some projects in the period I'm actually studying, but I mentioned modern slaveries earlier, and I have a publication coming out soon in the Ecumenical Review that essentially tries to put this concept I just outlined, asymmetrical dependency, in conversation with ecumenical discourse around modern slaveries. And I hope there's a bit of an academic component, but also a bit of a challenge to sort of continue this ongoing conversation that these dependency relationships have changed, and of course they're different in every context, but nonetheless persist as matters of real concern for the church.
Wow, fascinating. I would love to read some of the projects that you are working on, and it's very exciting, very important projects. Again, our advisors or our professors might not approve of the time we spend on the side projects. However, still very relevant, I think, for our vocations and for some of the things that we want to do in terms of who we are and impacting not only the society but also the church, and which I hear a lot from what you told me in this answer. Now, what we as doctoral students have to do is write a dissertation, and I think that's the biggest, project that we have to focus on during this journey that we call PhD. I would love to hear what you're working on for your dissertation project. What is your topic? What is the methodology you use? And if you can, just briefly, what is the main argument that you're trying to make within your dissertation?
Certainly. Yes. So one of the reasons I was really excited to come to Bonn is that within this dependency cluster, I mentioned before that my supervisor is a research group leader, and so our research group, like I said, focuses on late antique and early medieval Western church history. Um, and But I was really excited about that because most of the time, writing a PhD can be a very lonely endeavor. And at the end of the day, when it comes time to submit, hopefully toward the end of this year, early next year, it will be, sort of like Jesus walking the lonesome valley here. Not to compare myself to him, but there are some components of that remain. But nonetheless, we're able to work together on a shared project. So I have. In Germany, we call the person who supervises our dissertation either Dr. Mutter, Dr. Vater, or our parents.
Dr. Mother, Dr.
Vater. Exactly. Yeah, so my Dr. Mutter, Julia, she is also working on the same text that I'm working on. As is we kind of made this up, but my Dr. Schwister, my Dr. Sister, Henrietta von Hanier, is we're all working together on these early medieval, we could call them confessional manuals or compendiums of sins and practices of penance. The penitentials is what they're often called. So we're working together on these texts. My supervisor, Julia, is focusing in on how these texts treat what we might call capital sins. So homicide, abortive practices at the time, of course, witchcraft, and also looking at themes of enslavement. So where do enslaved people appear in these texts? Where can we identify hierarchical relationships? Some of that also comes over into my work. Henrietta is working very focused in on women who are present in the text in a very small way.
Right.
And then I look in and try to understand specifically how do these texts deal with questions around masculinity and around sexual expression, especially sexual expression among men, between two men, or between two or more men. And these texts, while hardly, no one would claim that they are in some ways a manifesto for liberty by any stretch of the imagination. They're would be quite repressive by most standards if applied today. Nevertheless, I think most people who haven't seen these texts or read them come away quite surprised at the detail that is present within them. So they do describe, I won't go into the details here, but basically every action that was conceivable, and then prescribe what they saw as an appropriate penance for that action. Not only for homoerotic behaviors, but for all forms of, for many forms of sexual expression, and basically for the daily lives of all people, especially those that would have been around a monastic community or influenced by it in some way. These texts eventually got sort of caught up in emergent canon law discourse during the Carolingian reforms. And while it's difficult to say how they influence the subsequent development of canon law, that's not really my focus, at least at this time. I think it gives us a helpful picture where this could connect to world Christianity conversation. So these are texts that emerged in Ireland, made their way over into what is now England, and then, of course, over into the Frankish territories, so onto the continent. But I've been very interested, even if it doesn't play a huge role in my dissertation in the end, in looking at how these texts were influenced by broader considerations. So they're quite theologically sparse, but they do often quote or are attributed to figures that have deep connections to the other peripheries of the old Roman Empire. So these would have emerged in the 5th century or so. So we can see influence of ideas going as far south as Egypt and North Africa, and definitely into Central Asia as well. So there is something to a world Christianity perspective on these texts. So yes, we're focused on the Western Church, but also complexifying, even in the early medieval period, these sort of simple bifurcations, and then also trying to zoom down into some very specific case studies at the same time. So
what I'm feeling is that you are really pushing the contours, the boundaries of world Christianity, not only thematically but also time-wise. We many times, oftentimes we also look at history, but we don't go as far as back as I think what you are talking about. So this is really innovative and very important, I think, work for world Christianity to broaden its horizon in terms of what can we talk about in world Christianity. We are here in Ghana talking about your dissertation project. It's just fascinating that we can talk about these things, whether we are in the North American context, European context, or even in the global South. And I think, thank you for sharing that. It's very fascinating, and I look forward to reading more of your work. Many blessings to you on the book of your dissertation project. But I want to now kind of segue into the last part of our conversation today, and that is thinking about world Christianity as a field in general. There has been a lot of conversations about, the future of our field. As a doctoral student, could you share some of your thoughts on our future? What are we missing here? What needs to be discussed more in terms of your perspective? And I'd love to hear, which direction should we, expand to or head towards to in terms of the direction of our field?
Absolutely. Well, in many ways, the beauty of world Christianity discourses is that these concerns can be raised from multiple perspectives. And so I'm quite certain that there are things, as we've learned at this conference here, that I would never have thought to raise. But so from my perspective, then I would say, I think there are many points, and we've even talked about a few now, but really where I think we are in the world Christianity conversation right now is we have to have a real conversation about not only gender, but gender and sexuality and the nexus between these two relationships, between these two realities. And there are these different streams in world Christianity conversations. There's we want to have a sort of rigid academic approach, and this is certainly a German approach in some ways. And then there are those who really see, as we've heard today in our discussions, world Christianity as a woman's movement, for example, world Christianity as a liberative movement, or as a discourse that can bring liberation. And I don't think anybody would say that world Christianity is an LGBTQ movement, or even would affirm that the alphabet soup approach to some form of advocacy should be transported around the world. But I would say, I'm conscious of where we are right now, and of laws that have been passed. And this isn't my country. I'm so delighted to have been welcomed to this place, and have felt the kindness of the Ghanaian people. And whatever laws are passed won't be targeting me per se, but they will be targeting people who live here, people who claim the same faith that we claim. And whatever you think about the particulars of how the church should respond, whatever you even think of human rights discourse as being something that's imposed, I don't believe that you can uphold what I understand to be fidelity to the gospel and affirm a rigid segregation between two classes of God's children. And the idea of not only barring people from the church, but of putting them in positions where their human rights, I'm comfortable with that language, maybe other people won't, their God-given dignity, I think we can all say that as Christians, will be not only denied, but violated. This is wrong. And as much as I think we understand in world Christianity conversations that the goal of the world Christianity scholar is not to impose one's ethical outlook upon others, there are, unfortunately, some things that require an either-or response. And so long as the church is intricately involved in the oppression of people because of their sexuality or their gender expression, this will put limits on our ability to live in a unified way amid diversity. That doesn't mean that whatever version of liberation we have advocated for in American churches, for example, has to come here, or that I certainly wouldn't advocate. As I said at the beginning of our talk, I'm quite familiar with the 50 years really of of all-out fighting that brought us to where we are now. So I'm not saying go and do as we have done. We know the problems with that. But nonetheless, the LGBTQ people, I will use that term, however they identify themselves, who are part of God's fold, God's human community, are God's children. And until we recognize that, until that's the foundation of the conversation, then we really are limiting ourselves. We are robbing ourselves of the opportunity to hear God's voice through a group of God's children. So I would say that's number one. I would also say that as especially churches, and if we want to say Western contexts, have started with varying degrees of success and intentionality dealing with our harmful legacy, our legacy of doing harm through mission, through things that I think many people really thought were for the betterment of God's kingdom, we could say. We're starting to deal with those legacies, and I would just affirm that and say we have to continue that conversation. And that will be, the results of those conversations, I think, will be painful, and I think they are. Not just for the perpetrators, but for those who have been victimized and who have survived, but also for everybody in between. Because as we were just on the Cape Coast, or the Gold Coast today, and earlier this week, and of course saw the castles that were there, used to transport sort of not the beginning of the journey, but the last step of the journey within on the continent of Africa before enslaved people would make their way across the sea. And you can't leave that without being aware of the fact that above both of multiple dungeons that we saw on this trip were churches in the same building, put on top of slave dungeons. This is something that the church is just now beginning to reckon with, I believe. And it's going to be painful, it's going to be divisive, but it must happen. And as academics, we have to be part of that conversation. And I would say that while the BCBSS is certainly not a church-affiliated organization, and they wouldn't bring this sort of theological, ecclesiastical commitment that I personally bring, the hard-hitting academic explorations advocated for by places like the Center for Dependency and Slavery in Bonn will provide essential data for diving into those conversations. And I will say, just if I could plug one more thing,
No, please.
one other activity at BCBSS, we now have a working group, so it's not a research group, but a working group on world Christianity and asymmetrical dependency research. And anyone is invited to take part, especially in the online sessions. And this is an academic exercise, but I certainly believe that this sort of focused academic research, bringing these concepts together and exploring how they can work, the sort of approach of world Christianity, the analytical concept of asymmetrical dependency, could shed new light on that conversation, and frankly on both of those conversations I raised. So.
If I'm not mistaken, Princeton Seminary students are also involved in that working group. Am I not right?
Absolutely, you're correct. And I, not only as an alum of both schools, but as somebody who really values the conversations that are happening at the OMSC and at PTS, especially in the History and Ecumenics department. It sounds like I'm campaigning for something, but I would say I hope that those conversations continue. Not only between students, but also as we make our way up. The possibilities for collaboration are, I won't say endless, but they're certainly present.
Well, thank you, David. I really appreciate your thoughts about the state of our field and, in a way, your vision, what you envision for the future in the directions that we need to go, and the boxes that we need to check as we move forward. One of the things that I know we prepared these questions ahead of time, but I wanted this last question to be kind of impromptu, and that is, I want you to fill out the rest of this sentence for me. World Christianity is, and then I know it is very from the top of your head kind of thing, but it doesn't have to be something big or fancy, but something that comes to mind. The world Christianity is to you. Could you complete that sentence?
Yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah.
I think I could manage something. We'll skip the sort of academic
Yes.
conversation and say, well, okay, within an academic conversation. So I think world Christianity studies, world Christianity as a discourse, as an approach, should be or is a fundamental paradigm shift in the way we understand everything having to do with Christian history, with theological education. I really do believe, as hard as it is sometimes, you know the work that we've talked about it that I work on, gender and sexuality. It's not easy in these conversations. It would be totally possible to work on that from within a Western context and be safe. It wouldn't be pleasant always, but be safe. But without, I don't want to say a global perspective, but without a perspective that breaks down old boundaries, that hegemonizes, to make a verb out of that term, a discourse that has been imposed upon people around the world, then I don't think we can actually make real progress. And I think, frankly, theological education in general, not just in the research, that can't engage with questions on a global scale in a world where what we understand to be globalization, as problematic as it has been, is definitely changing, and we don't know what it's moving toward. So both historically, conceptually, and theologically moving forward, I think if we haven't taken into account this perspective in all of our discourses, then we're missing something. So that's from systematic theology to church history to practical theology, not just putting world Christianity over as its own department, but across the field.
Thank you. I sense the pastoral voice in you in answering this question. Yes, it became not a sentence but a paragraph. But I got the.
You can cut it down. Like
I got the main point.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
David,
paradigm
yes,
shift.
of course. But David, thank you so much. I know in the midst of our conversation, we had cars passing through, we had conversations outside of this video, but still, that's what I think makes our world Christianity as a field, as a conversation, very authentic. And we're doing this here in Ghana, and I think that's even more wonderful that we can do this, showing that world Christianity is not only what we do in North American context and in the global North context, but here in the global South as well. And I really appreciate your time, taking the time with me during this World Christianity Conference to speak with me. And many blessings to you as you race towards the end of your PhD project and PhD journey. And thank you so much, Steve, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good to be with you.
All right, thank you.
Wonderful.